On a Sunday evening in late November 1971, Leslie Roberts, a public health nurse, narrowly avoided hitting a pickup that was stopped in the road on Highway 20 just outside of Williams Lake. 55-year-old Fred Quilt had drunk 2 bottles of vanilla extract with his adopted son Robin, sister-in-law Agnes, and wife Christine while driving home after a funeral at the nearby Anaheim Reserve when their truck stalled. After getting out of her car and talking with Fred, Leslie placed a blinking flashlight down on the road and drove 5 miles to Alexis Creek to report the situation to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP officers put the Quilt family in the cruiser and dropped them off at the Anaheim Reserve, almost 15 miles away from their home on the Stone Lake Reserve. When the officers returned to attend to the abandoned automobile, a bloodied Fred Quilt staggered to a house nearby where a friend's 2 daughters lived. The constables later testified that they placed flares 10 feet in front and behind the vehicle on the highway, and that when they returned with the towing equipment, they found the Quilt's truck had been pushed over an embankment and set on fire. Leaving Fred moaning in pain by the fireplace, Christine Quilt and Raymond Stump went to retrieve the truck, which they found engulfed in flames at the bottom of the embankment, far from the highway. They later testified that they had found the wrappers from flares laying next to the truck, and they reported this to the RCMP, who said they would investigate. A subsequent RCMP investigation was unable to recover any wrappers or flares from the scene. Meanwhile, Fred's condition was deteriorating. Mary Billy, a neighbor, went to get Sister Janita Cormier, a Roman Catholic nun and nurse who was on the reserve. While Sister Cormier bandaged his ribs, Fred told her that a policeman had kicked him. Concerned that his ribs were broken, she called the RCMP, telling them that Fred needed to go to the hospital. The call was received by the constable who had just earlier left Fred Quilt 15 miles from his home. He later testified that Sister Cormier had told him that a Patrick Quilt has some broken ribs. Seemingly unable to connect the phone call to the burned truck or the injured Fred Quilt he had just left behind, no ambulance was dispatched. Fred's pain was so severe now that his wife Christine twice went back to Sister Cormier to beg for help. She later walked a mile through the snow to ask for help from Father O'Brien. The oblate priest made repeated unsuccessful attempts to contact a local provincial judge he knew to ensure an ambulance was sent to the reserve. The next morning, Leslie Roberts, the public health nurse who first found Quilt and made the original call to the RCMP, stopped by to check on the Quilts. Discovering Fred in agony, she made a phone call demanding that an ambulance immediately be sent to pick him up. While they waited for it to arrive, Fred told her the same thing he had said to Sister Cormier, that his injuries were the result of being assaulted by the RCMP. An ambulance, transporting a dead child back to town, finally came for Fred Quilt, but he refused to enter the vehicle. According to Chilcotin belief, if someone travels with a corpse, they will be the next to die. Instead, Lawrence Stump drove Fred the 15 miles back to his home. At 1 p.m, 2 days after he was originally injured, an ambulance finally arrived and took him to the hospital in Williams Lake. The Quilt family was represented at the coroner's inquest by Henry Castello. The lawyer was still angry about what happened just 6 months earlier, when the RCMP had shot and killed an Aboriginal man named Douglas Higginbottom. Christine Quilt, one of the main witnesses at the inquest, only spoke Chilcotin. Through an interpreter, she testified that she had seen one of the constables repeatedly jumping on Fred with both feet after dumping him on the ground, while yelling, "Get up, you son of a bitch." After 3 hours of deliberation, the all-white jury found that Frederick Quilt of Stone Reserve, age 55 years, died on the 30th of November, AD 1972, as a result of peritonitis. We find this death was unnatural and that it was accidental. We attach no blame to any person in connection with the death. We recommend that assistance be provided to minority ethnic groups as to their rights pertaining to the law and obligations in giving testimony. The coroner, former RCMP officer Sid Leith, had allowed the RCMP to organize the inquest. Among the jury members was an RCMP auxiliary officer who lived with 2 other officers, The unapologetic bias displayed outraged the Aboriginal community. The Native Council of Canada, the British Columbia Association of Non-Status Indians, and the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs organized, and the inquest was eventually quashed by the BC Supreme Court. The court ruled that a coroner's jury, selected by a police officer and of which was composed of persons who were sympathetic to or might be sympathetic to the police, was an improperly constituted jury. A Vancouver lawyer, Harry Rankin, represented the Quilt family at the second inquest, which lasted 3 weeks. It read, in part, "We find that the death was caused by general peritonitis of the abdomen over a 48-hour period, caused by a perforation of the small bowel. The perforation was the result of an injury by way of an unknown blunt force applied by an unknown object to the lower right abdomen. The injury was sustained between the time Quilt was removed from the Quilt's vehicle and assisted to the police vehicle on the Chilcotin Road on November 28. Due to unwillingness of Quilt to avail himself of ambulance service and medical attention that was made available to him, Quilt's activities during this period of time, the modes of transportation, the conditions of the road, and the lapse of time were contributing factors." Years later, the Quilt's lawyer, Harry Rankin, wrote about his experience. The death of Fred Quilt, a Chilcotin Indian from Williams Lake, sets in clear relief the racism rampant in British Columbia. Out of all of the fallacies which many people labor under is that Canadian society is above such unjust practices. We become indignant about the lynching of a Negro in Georgia or the brutality of a police officer in Alabama, but are unaware or overlook or ignore the racism that flourishes right here. Haven't many people formed the conclusion that the Native Indians are drunken, dissolute, and don't want to work, etc.? That is racism. That is what happened to many of us. This is what happens when an Indian dies. If that is not injustice and racism, then these words have lost their meaning.